Chapter 18. Roland leaned back against the wall and idly listened to the traffic sounds on the street outside Grimmauld Place. There wasn't any action at all within Grimmauld Place itself. He had just finished reciting to himself the 17th chapter of the Non-Security Code and was about to begin the 18th when a huge black dog suddenly appeared, leaping in the middle of Grimmauld Place. It hadn't been there earlier, nor had Roland heard or seen a door open to let it out. Without pausing, the dog raced down the street, passing Roland. Roland followed the dog with his eyes while turning his head. Suddenly, the sky went dark. A huge gray-black cloud with silvery sparks appeared at the end of the street. Unable to slow down in time, the dog ran straight into the cloud. But it wasn't a cloud. It was a wall. The dog crashed and bounced off with a surprised yelp, and sparks of light glittered at the point of impact. Roland stared at the wall in confusion as he watched the sparks die out. He had never seen anything like it before. The cloud wall was solid black in color at the ground, and gradually grew to a dark gray the higher it rose. The huge dog ignored the wall, changed directions, and raced down one of the narrow walkways between buildings, obviously seeking another exit. Then Roland heard the distinctive crack of somebody apparating. He turned his head swiftly towards the sound, but saw no one. Someone must have just left. Returning his attention to the wall, Roland followed the shape of the sinister-looking cloud up, and saw that it reached into the sky, making a dark ceiling overhead, and seemed to surround the area like a huge, impenetrable bubble. The circular shape was vaguely familiar somehow, and he pondered on what it could be. As he sat, Roland suddenly noticed how eerily silent things were. He could no longer hear the sounds of traffic outside Grimmauld Place. Meanwhile, the black dog reappeared momentarily. The rapid click of his nails on the sidewalk sounded extraordinarily loud as he charged down another walkway between buildings on the other side of the street. Roland slipped his cell phone out of his pocket and opened it. This was way weird. He needed to report it right away. He pressed the button to turn the phone on. Nothing happened. No signal, no power, nothing. What now? He thought with growing concern. The rapid clicking of nails on the sidewalk momentarily distracted Roland. He turned his head as the dog emerged from between the buildings. It turned down the street and headed straight towards Roland at full speed. Without slowing, the dog leaped totally over Roland and continued running, swerving to go through the next nearest narrow walkway between buildings. Roland returned the cell phone to his pocket thoughtfully. What was that wall? Running through all possibilities in his mind, Roland's mind kept returning to one thing he knew of that was black and circular, but it couldn't be that. If it were, then it would mean... Roland's blood turned cold. It couldn't be, he thought with a growing sense of doom. I'd be dead if that were it, he told himself, and I'm not dead. But it was the only thing that seemed to fit. He was inside a death circle. A death circle was a circular black line that went anywhere from a hectare to a kilometer in diameter. The line was about 10 centimeters in width and appeared burnt, but no fire was ever seen to make it, nor could any amount of scrubbing rub it off. The circles would appear without warning at seemingly random locations. Their contents horrified muggles and wizards alike who encountered them. One minute everything looked fine, the next... The Nons called them death circles because of their shape and of the terrible things that happened within. Buildings collapsed, houses burned, and people died, most horribly. Nothing alive was ever known to come out of a death circle. Curiously, though all sorts of death and destruction appeared within the circle, there was never any evidence of damage just outside the circle. Roland had even heard of a story of a tree discovered half in, half out of the circle, its trunk carved out perfectly by the black burn mark completing the circular design. The Slytherins never acknowledged the existence of death circles, And the Muggles, well, surely they must have noticed the circular line surrounding some of the sites of terrorist destruction. But their news never mentioned a black circle. Wizard Pilkington insisted Roland read both Wizard and Muggle news daily. That in itself was not surprising. Since becoming an intern, Roland had noticed how closely Wizard security controlled the information reported in the Muggle news. The circles were a considerable source of whispered discussion within the non-community. Logically, some of the things discovered within a circle, completely burnt buildings and slow, torturous deaths, must have taken hours to happen. But no one ever seemed to notice anything amiss until it was too late. Roland remembered his parents wondering why the Muggles never seemed to notice a thing until it was all over. Then there was the night Roland had hid behind the doorway, when he should have been in bed, and listened as his shaken cousin Eric described a visit he had tried to make to his parents, Roland's aunt and uncle's house. Eric was apparating, but instead of arriving on the front doorstep, he bounced unexpectedly off a solid mass that landed him a block away. Eric tried and tried, but couldn't get any closer by apparating. So he decided to walk to their house, but couldn't do that either. He encountered a solid wall blocking the way. The wall had a chameleon-like appearance from the outside, so couldn't be seen, only felt, and Eric could detect several repelling wards, which, if he hadn't already found the wall and been so worried about his parents, would have sent him on his way none the wiser. Sick with worry, Eric waited for 2 hours just outside the wards. Suddenly, the wall disappeared. The repelling wards vanished, and Eric heard the distinctive cracks of several people disapparating. A familiar, sinister black line remained where the wall had been, and a sickening mass of bodies and debris appeared beyond. Eric had stared in shock at the flattened remains of his parents' home within the smoldering wreckage. Blood was spattered everywhere. Working frantically with the Muggle rescue crew, Eric hunted for his parents. He didn't find them. No one ever saw his parents afterwards, alive or dead. Only the day before, Eric's parents had protested loudly over the selection of Rodolphus Lestrange as Minister of Magic. His parents thought there must be some laws forbidding an ex-convict from becoming minister, even if he had been pardoned. Minister Malfoy had issued pardons for all the Death Eaters after their escape from Azkaban. Eric was certain the Death Eaters had created the circle and killed his parents, but there was no proof, of course, and no witnesses. Roland's parents advised Eric to not repeat his story to anyone. It could not be proven, would not bring his parents back, and would likely get him killed as well. But Eric's grief and thirst for justice and revenge far outweighed any sense of caution. Roland's parents argued with Eric long into the night against him taking some foolish course of action that would serve no purpose except get Eric and maybe the rest of the family killed. In the end, it was Roland who tipped the scales. Unable to remain quiet any longer, Roland had stepped out from behind the door. "I've already lost my aunt and uncle," he had quaveringly told Eric with tears streaming down his face. "I don't want to lose you too." And so Eric had reluctantly agreed to stay alive, for the children. Eric's story, names omitted, was whispered throughout the non-community. No one voiced further objection over the selection of Rodolphus Lestrange as Minister of Magic, nor was there any outcry over any of the new anti-Muggle, anti-Mudblood laws he proposed soon afterwards. There was no point. Despite outward appearances of legality and tolerance, the Dark Lord still ruled completely, and it was clear any opposition to his will would be ruthlessly eliminated. Roland's heart beat wildly while he tried to fight his panic. He reminded himself that he was still under a disillusionment charm. Whoever was doing this shouldn't know he was here. Perhaps, if he kept absolutely still, they'd miss him. Maybe he'd still have a chance to get out alive. Out. Wait a minute. Roland remembered hearing a loud crack after the wall went up, but no one was there. Someone must have disapparated out. Was that possible? Eric couldn't apparate in, but could people apparate out? It didn't seem likely, or his aunt or uncle would have apparated out. Unless They didn't have their wands. Roland slowly slid his wand out. He closed his eyes, thought of his home, his safe, secure home, and focused. Nothing happened. Perhaps he'd done it wrong somehow. Roland tried again. No place did he want to be more than his home right now. He tried to feel his way into nothingness and move with deliberation, just as he was instructed to during class last year. Nothing happened. With sinking certainty, Roland realized he could not apparate out. He was trapped. Another loud crack sounded. Roland opened his eyes and looked. His blood ran icy cold as he saw the tall female figure standing confidently within the center of Grimold Place. She had inky black hair twisted into a bun, but long tendrils of it hung loose and curled around her pale face. Her deep purple robe swirled about her body, and her wand extended menacingly. Bellatrix Lestrange. Wizard Pilkington made Roland read the histories of all the Death Eaters. He insisted Roland learn whatever he could, not wanting Roland to join security without being fully informed about his prospective employers. The recent stuff was easy to locate. The criminal records were buried under layers of dust at the school library. But getting people to talk about the Death Eaters, those who knew or had seen them in action, that was harder, much harder. Those who reluctantly talked told their tales in hushed whispers, afraid to be overheard. Of the few reports Roland had heard about Bellatrix Lestrange, the one that stood out most in his mind about her was simply, "Don't cross Bellatrix." It was a directive that seemed all the more fearful because of its lack of explanation. Roland had heard more once he started his internship. None of it was good. Even the Slytherin spoke of Bellatrix respectfully. Beneath a veneer of incredible beauty, she was said to have a soul so cold and heartless that it matched none other, except that of perhaps he who must not be named. Roland stared at Bellatrix in terror, scarcely breathing. "She doesn't know I'm here. She doesn't know I'm here," he kept repeating to himself, hoping it was true, while he tried to still his racing heart, fearing she would hear its roar despite her distance from him. A door to one of the houses opened up. An elderly lady with graying hair, dressed in a dark blue suit, stepped out, closing the door behind her. The lady looked curiously at Bellatrix. Bellatrix looked back. Then Bellatrix pointed her wand at the lady and shouted, "Avada Kedavra!" The lady dropped to the ground without a sound, dead. Roland closed his eyes and leaned his head against the wall, fighting the sudden terror and nausea that threatened to overwhelm him. He knew they were dangerous. They were all supposed to be cold-blooded murderers, but he hadn't taken it seriously, not seriously enough. Though the Slytherins in school were mean and nasty, he'd never seen them, well, couldn't imagine them. It was different seeing it with his own eyes. It was just so wrong. Even if Bellatrix didn't know Roland was there, could he sit quietly in hiding while she cold-bloodedly murdered everyone on the street? Meanwhile, Bellatrix calmly pointed her wand toward the houses behind the lady and shouted, "Obscuro Maximus!" in a loud, commanding voice. Immediately the house seemed to creak and groan. The windows and door of the house became black. Then they vanished altogether, becoming part of the house walls. Her spell had eliminated all access in and out of the house. "Obscuro Maximus!" she shouted again at the next house, rendering it windowless and doorless as well. From house to house she went, shouting, "Obscuro Maximus!" until all the buildings were solid walls with no entrance or exit. Roland opened his eyes and stared numbly at the walled buildings around him. Was this how they did it? Lock the victims in their houses out of the way until they were ready to kill them? Had his aunt and uncle died first or last? Bellatrix then extended her wand full length from her body and pointed it directly at Roland. "No, not me," Roland told himself frantically, while rooted to his place. "She doesn't see me. She doesn't know I'm here. She's just pointing her wand down the street my way." The wand gave off an eerie orange-red glow, but seemed to do nothing more. To his intense relief, Bellatrix slowly moved the wand away from Roland. She continued to move the wand away from him, aiming it at the nearby building and then the space beyond. Come out, wherever you are," she sang loudly in a playful voice, as she turned in a slow circle, moving the wand as she spoke. Roland stared at Bellatrix in surprise, his fear temporarily forgotten. To whom was she speaking? There was only himself and Bellatrix out in the streets, and she didn't seem to be seeking him. The light on the tip of her wand turned a blue-black color, and Bellatrix stopped turning. "Got you," she said with satisfaction. Bellatrix raised her other arm until it was waist-high. She lined her arm and hand in the same direction as her wand, twisting her wrist until the palm was facing up. Then Bellatrix closed her hand into a fist. "Accio," she said slowly, while she bent the arm, moving it up and back slowly, as if she were lifting something heavy. At first, nothing happened. But then something huge, black, and wriggling floated into view. It was the dog. Its whole body squirmed and twisted, the long legs seeking something, anything to grasp. A silver collar gleamed unnaturally bright around its neck. While Roland watched, the struggling dog floated closer and closer to Bellatrix, until it came to a halt just out of arm's length away. It dangled helplessly in front of her, as if suspended by an invisible line hanging from the sky. Still keeping her fist closed and elevated, Bellatrix watched the dog futilely jerk back and forth. Then she raised her fist slightly and twisted her wrist. Immediately the dog started to cough and gag as if it were choking. It briefly struggled more frantically, and then slowed its efforts to finally hang limply in front of her. Bellatrix straightened her wrist. The dog jerked briefly once, coughed, and started breathing, making a painfully loud, hoarse, rasping sound. She pointed her wand at the dog, causing it to spin slowly in place. "You've been very naughty," she scolded the dog as it twirled, "and need to be taught a lesson, one you won't forget for a very long time." The spinning stopped. The dog no longer struggled. It panted loudly. Its black legs hung down limply. "You look cold," she mused with mock concern, while the dog's sides heaved in and out. "Shall we warm up a bit before we get down to business?" Bellatrix's musical voice was light and pleasant, but the words somehow chilled Roland to the bone. What did she mean to do to the dog? He didn't have long to wait to find out. Bellatrix's wand dropped and pointed to the ground beneath the dog. A single flame appeared. The flame grew to the size of a small campfire, with no visible source of fuel. The dog stirred and tried to curl its black body into a ball in an effort to avoid the heat of the fire beneath it. But the flames grew higher. They flickered and touched the body, igniting the fur. The dog jerked convulsively as the fire raced across its body. Roland closed his eyes in horror, but he couldn't escape the scent that wafted his way, that of burnt hair, and then of flesh. "Expelliarmus!" Roland hadn't meant to leave his hiding place, hadn't meant to reveal his presence, but it was as if his feet and body moved of their own accord. He liked dogs, and couldn't bear to see one mistreated so. The wand flew out of Bellatrix's hand, the fire vanished, and the wand landed on the ground with a loud, ominous clatter. Roland froze in place, not knowing what to do next. He didn't know any other fighting spells. Once the opponent was disarmed during the duels at school, the battle ended. The fight was over. You bowed, and then waited until the opponent picked up his or her wand and left the floor. Nothing else was permitted. But this wasn't a school duel. Bellatrix turned her head towards Roland. My, she said sweetly in a musical voice, her hooded eyes seeking to see the source of interference through his disillusionment charm. "It seems as if someone new wants to play." She opened her fist, and the dog dropped to the ground. It collapsed silently into a heap in front of her, where it lay, unmoving. Then Bellatrix calmly held out her hand and commanded, Accio! The wand flew to her fingers, and she was again armed. Bellatrix pointed the wand in Roland's direction and waved it gently. Homo revilio, she commanded. The tip glowed green when it pointed directly at Roland. With a flick of her wrist, Roland felt as if liquid were oozing down his face and back. He knew the disillusionment charm had been broken. He stood exposed in front of Bellatrix. Roland quickly lowered his eyes, but remained rooted in place, too scared to move. Follow the rules, he told himself desperately, realizing it was too late to undo his impulsive act. While under the disillusionment charm, he still had a chance to get out alive, unnoticed. But there was no hope for that now. Even armed with a wand, Roland knew he was no match for Bellatrix. Roland's family had always emphasized the importance of life and survival. What should he do? Apologize? No. He doubted that would work. Plead? Beg? Doubtful. Roland had heard nothing that indicated Bellatrix had ever shown mercy. Look at me, came an icy command. Fearfully, Roland lifted his head and looked into the heavily lidded eyes of Bellatrix Lestrange. Why, you're only a boy, said Bellatrix while surveying Roland. Her voice softened to become that of an adult to a child. Despite his fear, Roland felt his face color. Boy, he was 17, old enough to make his own decisions. And a handsome one at that, Bellatrix added in a friendly tone, circling her wand playfully in his direction. Roland felt the flush on his face deepen. He didn't like being regarded like some piece of meat. He had gotten that a lot of times from the Slytherin girls at school and hated it. Roland gripped his wand tighter, but didn't speak. She's just another Slytherin, he told himself frantically. Her words mean nothing. She's trying to get me to break the rules. That's been tried hundreds of times before at school, and it's never worked. It won't work here either. But he had already broken the first rule, that of non-interference with Slytherin affairs. What's your name, boy? Bellatrix asked curiously. A mocking smile played on her lips, sensing that Roland didn't like being called boy. Roland swallowed nervously. He wasn't used to looking at Slytherins when he talked. Roland, ma'am, he said. Roland DeWitt. And polite, too, she added approvingly. Tell me, Roland DeWitt, Bellatrix continued in a light, playful voice, all the while staring intently at him. Do you want to die? Roland's mouth instantly dried up, and his body felt numb as he stared at her. He heard no playfulness in the last part. The question was no joke. Bellatrix's voice was deadly serious, and her hooded eyes icy cold. She watched him steadily while waiting for an answer. Roland gulped. What should he say? A part of him wanted to sound brave and confident, but that wasn't true, and he had been taught to answer all direct questions honestly. She would know if he answered otherwise. No, ma'am, he whispered, afraid if he spoke louder, his voice would crack and further betray his fear. Bellatrix smiled, visibly relaxing. Good, she said pleasantly with a nod of her head. She lowered her wand invitingly. Seeing this, Roland also relaxed and let his wand drop. He ventured a quick breath of relief. Perhaps he had done something right. Maybe she wasn't so bad as they all said. Maybe he'd get out of this. Crucio! Bellatrix had whipped her wand up so fast Roland hadn't even seen it happen. His wand dropped from his hand, and he was on the ground, experiencing an agony such as never before. Roland's bones seemed to be on fire. Every nerve in his body burned unceasingly. He rolled on the ground, screaming helplessly. Abruptly, the pain stopped. Roland gasped for air, struggling to regain his senses. Dimly, he heard Bellatrix speak. I was hoping you'd say that, she said coldly. Crucio! Again, Roland rolled in such pain he was scarce able to breathe. No! His mind screamed out, but the only sound he could make were screams of agony. The pain stopped again. Roland lay panting weakly, unable to move. "I wonder how long you will last," came Bellatrix's icy, impersonal voice. "Crucio!" "No!" Roland's mind screamed in protest, suddenly realizing what she was doing. "No, no, 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 no!" He'd read about the Longbottoms, seen Cedric Diggory, to be condemned to a life of nothing. No! But that didn't stop the searing pain that coursed through his body without end. It didn't stop him from screaming non-stop at the top of his lungs and convulsing uncontrollably in reactions to her curse. After what seemed like an eternity, the pain stopped again. Roland lay unmoving on the ground, breathing heavily. His mind felt numb and his throat raw. Tears streamed out of his eyes from the pain. As he lay there, he became aware of a cooling breeze blowing on his face and sunlight streaming down on him. He could also hear a savage growling behind him. The growling continued steadily. Roland rolled himself over to find its source. All he could see was a blur of purple and black. Balancing himself on one arm, Roland raised himself higher. The growling got louder. Roland rubbed his eyes and squinted in an effort to clear his vision. When he looked again, his adrenaline rushed in, and Roland forgot all thoughts of pain and weariness. Lying still on the ground in a widening pool of blood was Bellatrix Lestrange. On top of her body, with his jaws at her throat, stood the big, black dog. The dog lifted his head, turning it to look at Roland. Its body and black legs were horribly burnt. Red blood dripped from his jaws. Roland watched in horror while the dog calmly bent its head back down, burying its muzzle in what was left of the neck of Bellatrix. There was so much blood, Roland couldn't even see her face. Roland shuddered when he heard the distinctive crunch of breaking bones. Roland slowly lowered the hand from his face and reached into his pocket. The motion attracted the dog. Almost immediately he looked again at Roland and snarled warningly. His lips curled up, showing long, pointy white teeth, shiny red with blood. "Easy, boy," said Roland softly, his scratchy voice quavering. "I'm not going to hurt you," as if he could have, lying on the ground like he was. "I'm just getting my phone," Roland added informatively while pulling out the phone, showing it to the dog. It wasn't as if the dog could understand, but Roland knew a soothing voice could help calm animals. The growling stopped, but the bloody teeth remained bared, and the dog watched Roland suspiciously. With a trembling hand, Roland opened the phone and turned it on. To his immense relief, he got a signal. Roland pressed redial and anxiously held the phone to his ear, listening for its ring. "Report?" came a familiar, calm voice. "She's dead," blurted Roland, unable to contain himself. "Who? The girl?" the voice on the other end asked quickly. "No," replied Roland urgently. "The Queen!" "Who?" said the voice with alarm. "The Queen Bee is dead," Roland repeated, using non-slang for Bellatrix Lestrange. "Just now," he added. There was a long silence as the person on the other end digested the news. "Dead?" repeated the voice in disbelief. "Yes," confirmed Roland. "How? The girl?" "No," replied Roland with frustration. "I haven't even seen the girl. It was a big black dog." "You sure?" Roland raised his head and looked into the pale eyes of the dog, blood still dripping from its jaws. "Oh, yeah," he confirmed in a whisper. "I'm looking right at him." There was a longer silence. Then, "You okay?" "For now," replied Roland, unable to look away from those dripping teeth. "Then get out of there." "Huh?" "The authorities will be there soon. You need to get away now, while you can. Call me as soon as you're clear. I'll be waiting." Yes, sir," said Roland. He closed the phone and carefully slipped it back into his pocket, all the while watching the dog. "Get out of here," he muttered to himself. "Right." Roland slowly stood, balancing himself on shaky legs. He looked around for his wand, finally spotting it on the ground in a rivulet of blood partially covered by Bellatrix's purple robe. Roland took a stumbling step towards it. The dog instantly growled warningly. Roland froze. "Easy," he told the dog. "I'm just getting my wand." He slid his foot cautiously forward, all the while watching the dog. The growling increased to a fierce snarl. The dog crouched down and faced Roland menacingly, looking ready to attack. "Okay, okay," said Roland to the dog in a placating voice as he slid his foot back. The growling immediately stopped, but the dog remained crouched, alertly watching Roland. Roland wanted his wand, but had no desire to face those teeth. He would have to leave his wand behind. Roland backed away carefully. He turned and headed up the street. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of people coming out of the houses. Then he heard the shouts and screams as they saw the bodies lying on the ground.